Good morning. Welcome to the Prado Museum in Madrid, Spain. We're continuing our Wednesday morning series of short conversations in English, thanks to the support of the American Friends of the Prado Museum. The American Friends is a nonprofit organization, and we are dedicated to supporting the museum and helping share the treasures in this collection in as many ways as we can. And today we have the enormous pleasure of being in room 58, and I'm standing in front of what might be one of the most recognizable paintings in the collection, and maybe one of the most emotionally powerful as well. This is Rogier Van der Weyden's Descent from the Cross. Rogier Van der Weyden was very successful in his lifetime, and he was a court painter, and he was well known throughout Europe. This is one of his most important paintings, and it's even one of the most important from the first half of the 15th century. It was commissioned by the Crossbowmen's Guild for a chapel in Leuven around 1430. And if we look in the upper corners of the painting, we can even see references to this guild in the tracery. We can see crossbows, teeny tiny little crossbows there at the top. Mary of Hungary purchased the painting, and then she hung it in her private chapel in Binch, and then her nephew, Philip II, he brought it to Madrid, and then he placed it in his chapel in El Pardo Palace, and then he took it to El Escorial, and it stayed there until 1939 when it came to the museum. It was cleaned in 1992, and thankfully it is in excellent condition. The scene that is depicted is right after Jesus has been taken down from the cross. The servant at the top is still holding these horrifyingly long nails. I don't know if we can see it because of the glare, but he has these really long blood-stained nails in his hand. The man at the base of the cross receiving Jesus is probably Nicodemus. This is a Pharisee who helped Joseph of Arimathea give Jesus a proper burial. Behind him is another servant, and he's holding the pot that is the attribute of Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene is standing here next to him. The pot refers to the pot that Mary Magdalene used holding anointing oil, referring to the scene when she anointed Jesus' feet with an aromatic, expensive oil using just her hair. Mary Magdalene's position and her gesture help to frame this side of the composition. So now let's go see the figures on the other side. Let's see who is on the other side of the painting. Framing the left side of the composition, we have Mary Cleophas and St. John. And then Mary Salome is holding up the Virgin Mary. Mary Salome is dressed in green here, and she's holding up the Virgin who has collapsed in grief. Now, as with any great work of art, of course, there are so many layers of meaning in this painting, and we'll just touch on a few of them today, but hopefully we'll bring you a little bit closer to the work to enrich your experience of it, and maybe go a little bit deeper than what is immediately so clear to us, which is the beauty and the technical excellence of the painting. So the first thing that we're going to think about is the idea of reality versus illusion. Now, clearly, the painter is making us feel realistic, like that this is a realistic scene, that it is believable, it's lifelike, and he does this with very precise painting of details. Let's look at the blood that drips from Jesus' wound. If we see the blood that's dripping down, we can see that it drips in two directions. It drips directly down from when he was hanging on the cross, and then it even starts to come down from his current position. And of course, and see how transparent that cloth is, that we can see the blood that even drips down below. Of course, with what is characteristic of all Flemish painting is this meticulous detail in the textures as well, in the clothing, in these velvety robes with crisp folds. We can also look at the details of these fur-lined hems. Absolutely beautiful. In some ways, it almost seems more than real. This even seems like a work of hyper-realism in some ways. But if we step back, it seems also like there's something that's kind of off here. It seems like there's something about the placement of the figures that makes us feel a little bit uneasy. And like this, we have a sense that this is really not physically possible. And look at the placement of the cross, for example, where the cross touches behind the tracery here. The top of the cross and the ladder that touch the top of the tracery, so they're really close to the picture plane. And then look at the base of those objects, where the cross and the ladder somehow have left all of this space for Nicodemus and Jesus and Mary to be in front of it. So this is not really sound perspective. It seems like the cross would have had to have been leaning forward, really, to leave space for all of these people. And Van der Weyden kind of, he hid this incongruence with extending the Virgin's leg and her dress to kind of subtly hide the base of the cross and the ladder to make this a little bit less obvious. Also, these figures really are occupying a very unreal space. They're not really in any real setting. They're in this kind of golden box, so there is no real sense of perspective. And furthermore, it seems like they can barely fit in this box. It seems like they can hardly be contained in it. And these things are at least in part because Van der Weyden was influenced by sculpture. In some ways, this lack of a background and these near life-size dimensions do make the figures kind of pop out more. It makes them feel like they have 3 dimensions. In fact, we could even say that these monumental figures that look like they're frozen in action, it looks like they kind of have a statuesque quality. Now, we think that Rogier Van der Weyden trained in Robert Campin's workshop in Tournai, and the sculpture industry was very important there. Also remember that historically sculptors and painters have competed for artistic prestige, and this painting seems like Van der Weyden is challenging sculptors. It kind of looks like a declaration of, look what is possible with painting, look how lifelike figures can be with just 2 dimensions. So the whole experience when you're standing in front of this is one of realism, but when you look closely, in truth, it's really only realistic in the details. And the other thing that we have to keep in mind when we're looking at this painting is emotion. And maybe even more than emotion, empathy. This painting is masterful in the way it succeeds in conveying emotion through expressions, through tears, red-rimmed eyes, and gruesome wounds. And this is all immediately obvious to us. We can identify with these expressions of grief and of physical pain. But the artist goes even further, and he uses a subtle language of forms, rhythm, and repetition to show emotion as well. Notice how the Virgin Mary's slumped body, if we step back for 1 minute, and let's see the Virgin Mary's slumped body, the shape and the position of her body, and see how it echoes that of her son. It is almost like Mary has kind of figuratively, emotionally died with her son's physical death. The color has drained from her face. We can see tears rolling down. Her body is completely limp. The overwhelming pain has caused her to lose her consciousness. And it seems like her actions kind of mirror the actions of Jesus. And what's funny is that, in fact, neuroscience tells us today that this is how empathy works, right? That when we see a person experiencing an emotion or a physical state, that we share that feeling to, and we are even subconsciously inclined to imitate that person's gesture or their facial expression. So really, how clever was Van der Weyden for showing us the Virgin's emotional state in this way? And we also have to think of this idea of empathy with the spirituality of the time, which was Christ-centric, meaning that images were frequently centered around the life and the passion of Christ, which was depicted with a lot of intense emotion to arouse an empathetic response from the viewer. And this was entwined with religious sentiment. So this painting is really showing us how the followers were supposed to feel when confronted with the idea of Christ's passion and death. And it's also interesting to know at this time that there was an important emphasis on the role of Mary in religious texts. There were some Vita Christi, or the books that retell the life of Christ, that were even told from the Virgin Mary's point of view. And we can see her protagonism in this scene. We can see where her emotional death is almost as prominent and almost as moving as her son's physical death. It is a fascinating painting, and we could stay here all day long looking at all of the details and talking about it. Before we go, I want to point out one last thing. We remember that this was commissioned by the Guild of the Crossbowmen, and we saw that in the tracery at the beginning. And now that we've come back out, notice how the position of the bodies of Mary and Jesus also echo that shape of a crossbow. So I hope that you've enjoyed having a look at this beautiful masterpiece with me today. If you have the chance to come see it in Madrid, I encourage you to do so because it's such a delight. And if you don't, you're still in luck because we have a lot of information about Van der Weyden on our website, both in Spanish and in English. You can also find out more about the American Friends and our sister organization, the Fundación de Amigos. So thank you for joining me today, and we'll see you again for more conversations in English next Wednesday.